Hey, everybody. Welcome to another installment of the American Modern, starting in Paris. Okay. Well, we were starting to go over some of the revolutionary features of Stein's work, and we talked about her use her use of poetic literary devices in prose, and we talked about the repetition for characterization, and we looked at a couple of examples of that. And you remember that first, I mentioned page 171, 172, the very first, the opening paragraphs of the gentle Lena. You have the word pleasant repeated 5 times, the word gentle repeated 6 times, the word Germany or German repeated 8 times, the word patient repeated 6 times, the word good repeated 4 times, very well, or some variation of like very well, liked her very well, or liked it very well, repeated 4 times. What is the consequence of this kind of this kind of repetition? And really, part of what I'm asking is, why do our creative writing teachers and our composition teachers teach us not to write this way? I mean, in other words, it's just like with Picasso and Cezanne and Matisse. Why is this bad writing? What's the problem here? Well, and ask yourself, if we were in a face-to-face class, I'd ask you, but just to answer the question, the repetition, eventually, I don't know what you might call the semantic precision, or the semantic lucidity, the semantic power of the word recedes, doesn't it? It becomes semantically less important and less important and less important. Another way of putting it, fancy way of putting it, the semantic lucidity of the word, the semantic transmission of the word as representation of signified is put under erasure, repetition by repetition by repetition by repetition. You see? In other words, the more times you hear the word gentle, the less the word gentle takes on meaning, and you just stop hearing it in the same way. It's as if language by repetition is put under erasure. I should say more precisely, the signifying property, which is its core property, the signifying property of language is put under erasure. It fades. What's going on there? Well, one way to understand this is and I'll talk more about this in other ways, it's a kind of linguistic enactment of the erasure of character that this culturally marginal figure, Lena, is subject to every day by the quotidian repetitions of her own life. You see? And this is not explained to you in expositional prose by Stein. It's not explained to you, that difference between showing and telling. This isn't told to you. I'm tempted to say it's not even shown to you. It's embodied, it's enacted in the prose, almost beyond the semantic properties of the language that Stein uses to express it. You see? It's an enactment of Lena. It is Lena. It's not the finger pointing at the moon, but the moon. And we, as readers, I mean, when I say as readers, not just as sort of conceptual readers, but actual, physical readers. I'm thinking of sort of the optic nerve and the sort of consciousness analogy of the optic nerve, our medullas, whatever the case is. I don't know. I don't know enough about consciousness and brain physiology, but whatever it is, it's too much repetition. You remember how we talked about when the eyes see, if the eyes wouldn't move, they would cease to see? This is the repetition. It's effaced, and it effaces the semiotic, the symbolic property, the semantic property of language, and we become Lena, making her way through the tedium of her life, the tedium that is Lena. We don't just read about it. We're not just shown it. We become it. Now that's powerful subjective juju happening there. That's powerful artistic juju that allows us to not just understand, but become the character. Pretty extraordinary. Okay. Yeah. What is the consequence? I'm just going back to my notes here just to make sure I touch all the bases. The repetition achieves a kind of banality, doesn't it? The semantic referentiality of the word recedes, right? The plasticity, the materiality of the word emerges. That is, text becomes texture. And think of painting and how close that is to transparency becoming texture, an assertion of the subjective seeing subject of the artist. So that's another thing that happens with this repetition, right? Not only is the meaning of the words, the meaning of the words effaced, it's an assertion of that authorial presence. In other words, there's somebody doing this repetition. You see, it's no longer transparent. It's an assertion of the writerly subject, in the prose. It's a violation of authorial transparency, intentional, with really profound and engaging and interesting and modern philosophical implications and artistic implications. What I always think of those Warhols, those sort of silk screened Warhols in which you see 48 images of Elvis in exactly the same pose with slightly different coloration in every single silk screened image. And after a while, this mythic image of Elvis Presley, this sort of mythologically American image or Marilyn, same thing happens with it's what Warhol's interested in. Those images are kind of drained of their, in the case of the image, their semiotic power. At some point, we can talk about the difference between the semantic and the semiotic. Long story short, semantic refers to words and what words do. Their status as signified toward a signifier. Semiotic property of an image is the symbolic potency that it has with respect to the culture in which it is produced, and which in turn it produces as an image in it. You see what I'm saying? And we identify ourselves with respect to, for and against the semiotic universe in which the subjectivity finds itself. It's part of how we identify as human beings, right? Okay. Continuing these revolutionary features of Stein's work, there's a reliance on a highly pictorial, in other words, a highly painterly, bing, 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 a highly pictorial, there's a reliance on highly pictorial imaging for the rendering of character, right? In other words, it's a move, it's a strategy that's antithetical to the psychological proposition and the psychological description of character that literary realism almost defines itself by, right? You know, think of our great realist artists. Think of Henry James. Think of Edith Wharton. Think of Jane Austen. Think of George Eliot, etc. And the beautiful, careful, thorough rendering of the psychological complexity of their characters, right? Stein's highly pictorial imaging, it moves us in a different direction where we're forced to understand or we're allowed to understand character, forced / allowed, depending upon, you know, depending on whether you like Stein or not, or understand Stein or not. We're forced or allowed to see character in a different way, to see in other words, y'all, to see the very notion of character, not just the characters, but the notion of character and characterization in a different way, right? And it's, of course, under the influence of the modernist painters, Matisse, Woman with a Hat, the green stripe, Madame Matisse, etc. So Woman with a Hat, the green stripe, Madame Matisse in particular, both of which, of course, as I've said, she owned, right? So you think of the, there's a certain characterological flatness in these. You notice that? There's sort of a flatness, a two-dimensionality that Stein's getting across here. Again, an enactment of character rather than a depiction in prose, a lucid depiction in prose of character. And you think of the classics of the psychological description of character. You think of Dorothy and Casaubon in Middlemarch, Eliot's great novel. You think of Emma and Charles in Madame Bovary, Flaubert's great novel. Beautiful and fully realized descriptions of psychological character. Stein doesn't operate in that way. You remember the passage involving Brown, the word brown that I read last time on page 172 in this text. I'm not going to read that one again. That's a good example. But let me also look at 174 in this text. So this is the paragraph in the gentle Lena beginning, these two girls the mother had brought up. These two girls the mother had brought up. Okay. These two girls the mother had brought up very firmly. They were well taught for their position. They were always both well dressed in the same kinds of hats and dresses, as is becoming in two German sisters. The mother liked to have them dressed in red. Their best clothes were red dresses made of good heavy cloth and strongly trimmed with a braid of glistening black. They had stiff red felt hats trimmed with black velvet ribbon and a bird. The mother, dressed matronly in a bonnet and in black, always sat between her two big daughters, firm, directing, and repressed. Wonderful. But the color red, like the color brown in the previous passage, you feel it almost strikes me. It's a Cézanne portrait. It's a Matisse portrait. It's a Cézanne, right? Highly colorized. And I don't want to impute some kind of universally symbolic value to the color red. I don't think that's the point. I think that's a mistake. The point is that we see these characters with a kind of vividness, a kind of fauve vividness, a kind of Matissean, Cézannian vividness that Flaubert, for example, doesn't give us character by, and no one wants him to, right? But it's a different style of the rendering of character and the rendering of scene. Okay. There's also, I spent a little time on this, there's also a kind of general, I'm just going to call it a remoteness of tone a kind of a remoteness of tone, a reportorial quality in Stein's prose. But this is complex, because you'll have a paragraph that will begin with this remoteness, with this reportorial quality, with this flatness that's not just objective, but kind of objectifying. So you have this factuality established in simple, declarative, repetitive, syntactical presentation. Let me read that again. Simple, declarative, repetitive, syntactical presentation, free of metaphor, right? There's a kind of eviscerated, this is my reading, there's a kind of eviscerated quality, a tranquilized quality, a deadened quality. It's a kind of paralyzed a description, a kind of etherized, using Eliot's famous phrase, famous word, an etherized condition. But notice what happens. Let's just take a look at a passage here. Page 176. And this is in the Gentle Lena, 176. And it's the paragraph beginning, Lena was willing to go with Mrs. Hayden. Everybody have that? Lena was willing to go with Mrs. Hayden. Lena was willing to go with Miss Hayden with all her hardness. I'm sorry. Lena was willing to go with Mrs. Hayden. Lena did not like her German life very well. It was not the hard work, but the roughness that disturbed her. The people were not gentle, and the men, when they were glad, were very boisterous and would lay hold of her and roughly tease her. They were good people enough around her, but it was all harsh and dreary for her. Lena did not really know that she did not like it. She did not know that she was always dreamy and not there. She did not think whether it would be different for her away off there in Bridgepoint. Mrs. Hayden took her and got her different kinds of dresses, and then took her with them to the steamer. Lena did not really know what it was that had happened to her. Okay, so you get a sense for that flatness, right? Now, let me move to another passage here. Turn to page 183 in this text. And listen to so that good example of that reportorial flatness. That there's it's an enervated style of description, drained of fight, right? Drained of resistance, drained even of critical intelligence. And you see an enactment of the condition of the subject it's describing, stylistically, right? Now let me read you this, though. Look what happens tonally in this work. This is the paragraph beginning, "At last it was decided that the wedding should be put off. At last it was decided." Okay, I'm just going to skip into that paragraph. Maybe 3 sentences. Did you see that? Actually, it's the next paragraph. Mrs. Hayden sent word around. Mrs. Hayden sent word around. This is 183. Mrs. Hayden sent word around about waiting until a week from that Tuesday to everybody that had been invited. And then Tuesday morning, she sent for Lena to come down and see her. Mrs. Hayden was very angry with poor Lena when she saw her. She scolded her hard because she was so notice how measured that description is, how reportorial, how emotionally calm. Mrs. Hayden was very angry with poor Lena when she saw her. She scolded her hard because she was so foolish. And now Herman had gone off and nobody could tell where he had gone to. And all because Lena always was so dumb and silly. And Mrs. Hayden was just like a mother to her. And Lena always stood there so stupid and did not answer what anybody asked her. And Herman was so silly too. And now his father had to go and find him. Mrs. Hayden did not think that any old people should be good to their children. Their children always were so thankless, never paid any attention, and older people were always doing things for their good. Did Lena think it gave Mrs. Hayden any pleasure to work so hard to make Lena happy and get her a good husband? And then Lena was so thankless and never did anything that anybody wanted. It was a lesson to poor Mrs. Hayden not to do things anymore for anybody. Let everybody take care of themselves and never come to her with any troubles, and so on. So you see what's happening there. In a playful contrast to the pretense of reportorial prose, Stein presents the reader with a shift in the mode of discourse from the reportorial to the highly affective, that's with an A, the highly affective and highly subjective. Let me just read that again. Stein presents the reader with a shift in the mode of discourse from the reportorial to the highly affective and subjective. The language of the third person narrator assumes the first person voice of the character. Let me say that again. The language of the third person narrator, which is where we start out with in the paragraph, assumes the first person voice of the character. You start to read a verbal enactment of the subject's condition, the narrator's condition, rendered not expositionally, but immediately. You have what ought to be a third person, a point of view, a narrative point of view, a narrative speaker, a speakerly consciousness, if you will, that's objective, right? That's trustworthy. But Stein suffuses without changing person, right? So the point of view is still third person, but that third person narrator, which ought to be objective, which ought to be remote, right? Which in fact has been remote, becomes suffused with subjectivity, even though it's still in the third person mode. Yeah? That's a violation of one of the bedrock rules of narrative composition, consistency of narrative voice. This is a violation of the rule of consistency. It's quote unquote bad writing, yet it accomplishes something profound, doesn't it? Let's think about that a little bit. The character, how should I put this? The character who most strongly associated at this point in the narrative with that third person objective voice. In other words, you're seeing, I don't want to say you're seeing from Mrs. Hayden's point of view, but the point of view is kind of tending toward her perspective, the omniscient point of view, right? Third person omniscient point of view is tending from her perspective here, right? But the objectivity in it recedes and it's filled with the subjectivity. So in the violation of this law of orderly third person omniscient presentation and narrative building, in the violation, the subjective condition of the character emerges very powerfully. And you feel very powerfully her sense of resentment, her sense of authority being defied, her sense of control being relinquished, being taken from her, and her anger at that control being taken from her, and so on. And it becomes psychologically very powerful and very accurate. But it's not accurately, it's not powerful and accurate as in the way that a conventional narrative ought to render that type of power and accuracy, right? And it's precisely in the evasion of those third person, of the regulatory structure of third person omniscient narrative presentation, it's precisely in the violation of that the power emerges. And that's modernist, right? Incidentally, you'll see this, I'll name this later. This narrative move actually has a name, which I'll get to with Hurston, the great American master of this mode. We'll see that later. But you can see it emerging early in Stein. Another consequence of this is in the presence of the authorial voice, which begins as remote, as calm, as, if you will, in Vermeer's sense, in the world of in the world of painters, in the world of painting, as transparent, right? This section begins with a sort of a transparent narration, remote, calm, objective. But that remote quality is lost. And what happens is the narrativity of the narrative is foregrounded. The narrativity, in other words, the status of the narrative as narrative, the status of the narrative qua narrative emerges, asserts itself. So as opposed to the narrativity being so transparently expressed that you don't feel it at all. In other words, it's as if the narrative is happening to you. So realistic is its presentation in that beautiful realist prose, right? A la George Eliot, a la Dickens, a la Emma Bovary, a la Henry James, a la Edith Wharton, right? So transparent is the prose that you feel what the characters must feel. Here, the narrativity of the narrativity of the narrative, the status of the narrative as narrative is increased, is made more present. And so the authorial voice, Stein's own voice, is foregrounded. In other words, you start to see the writer in these moments as well, right? So the narrativity of the narrative is foregrounded. The character of the narrative is revealed as shifting, indefinite, inconsistent, and makes possible the sort of unreliability in the narrative. So let me just give you that language again. The character of the narrative is revealed as shifting. The character of not just the narrative, but of narrative, is revealed as shifting, indefinite, inconsistent. It's very, very powerful. Okay. So you have conventional narrative hierarchies. The narrator, who provides a narrative voice, a narrative tone, who is the speaker, quote unquote, the speakerly voice, even if omniscient, there's a kind of speakerly tone in that calm, remote, distance narrative, right? The person of the narrative, that's what provides the person, right? So that's the relationship between the narrator and the narrative, right? Providing narrative voice, speakerly voice, the person of first person or third person or second person. And so beyond simply telling the story, that's the narrative, that's the purpose of the narrative, right? That's what the narrative provides for us, that tonality, that kind of speakerly presence, that tone. So narrative provides tonal organization. Narrative provides a coherence of perspective, right? But here, that narrator is made contingent upon or subordinate to what is narrated, which is the woman's anger, resentment, sense of loss of power. So it's very powerful because what had been being depicted calmly, objectively in reportorial prose actually becomes suffused with the very emotional life of the individual in question. And it's as if the emotional life of the character literally takes over the way the character's story is being told. And there's something very liberating in that. It's also very disruptive, right? Particularly if you're used to classically realist prose. Good. Okay, well, good stuff. I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going past my rightful time limits here, having given you so much video to watch in these last few days. So I'm gonna cut it short. I think that accomplishes what we want to accomplish for Stein. And just remember that as you're reading, we spent most time on the Gentilina, but as you're reading Melanctha and Anna, you can see the same principles at work. I think you see them functioning most apparently in the Gentilina, and that's why I typically start with this. But in your own reading, apply them to Melanctha as well. It's always nice when a prop doesn't cover a particular stories too closely, because that gives you the space to do what you will in your discussion assignments, and also later in the paper if you have something you'd like to say about stories that we don't cover so closely. Okay, very good. Well, I want to continue our journey into what's going on in American music at this time, as kind of a counterpoint to the kind of Paris-ocentric world we're focusing on here at the beginning. I think we're doing that appropriately. But let's remember too that there is an American modern building here as well, and jazz, I think, is our way into that. And so I want to talk a little bit about Sidney Bechet. As I say on the slide here, he was part of the Revue Nègre, the Negro Review, a word I'm not comfortable using. This is nègre. This is not the slur. This is French for Negro, which came with the famous Josephine Baker. I'll talk more about Baker in future lectures. The fabulous Josephine Baker at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris in 1925. And Bechet lived in Europe for quite a long time, quite a number of years. I think just offhand, I think it was in the neighborhood of 11 years. And I want to teach a course in in Black Paris. In other words, the kind of refuge that Paris offered to African American artists of all types, including literary, including dance, including music, and so on. That Paris began to offer right around our time period, and it was jazz that opened the doors. And a lot of, as you know, those of you who studied African American literature, with our great professors in our department, Dr. Charles and Dr. Gibson, you're acquainted with this. But I want to talk about Sidney Bechet. So we have Jelly Roll Morton, a very early figure, 1903, 1904. And Bechet was somebody that Morton lived a good number of years. Bechet was somebody that Morton knew from the New Orleans scene. And I just want to read from Ken Burns and Jeff Ward's book one more time. Bechet quickly earned two reputations. As a difficult personality, he describes himself as "quote unquote powerful mean." "Quote unquote powerful mean." He once admitted, and unwilling to work in any band in which anyone was paid a penny more than he was. And secondly, as a clarinet player, unlike any other, in New Orleans or anywhere else, who saw music as something like a perpetual combat in which he was determined always to come out on top. And you can feel that sense of fight in his music. I love that. New Orleans brass band music was an ensemble art. In other words, it was an art played among many. Each individual in each ensemble having his or her moment in the spotlight, musically speaking, able to express improvisationally themselves. New Orleans brass band music was an ensemble art, but the cornetist, in other words, the cornet is a kind of akin to the trumpet, cornet, very similar instruments. The cornetist had generally been the first among equals. It was he who played the lead, the cornetist, stating the theme around which the clarinet was expected to weave obbligato embellishments, right? Often improvised obbligato embellishments. So the improvisation is included in the word obbligato. But second best was never enough for Sidney Bechet. He tried playing lead cornet himself for a time, and was said by those who heard him to have been as loud and forceful as anyone in town. But even on clarinet, he performed with such power that he routinely overshadowed cornetists accustomed to the hero's role. Quote, when Sidney was playing around 1914, 1916, so a wee bit later than Jelly Roll, when Sidney was playing around 1914, 1916, his fellow clarinetist Albert Nicholas said, quote, he outplayed them all. Okay, so this is Sidney Bechet, Wildcat Blues, recorded in 1923. Jay. Okay, yeah, very good. Now I should have mentioned I should have mentioned earlier. Uh, get back here. Uh, that features Louis Armstrong on trumpet, um, and Clarence Williams on piano. I'll talk more about Louis Armstrong very soon, perhaps next time, and maybe do one or two figures before Louis Armstrong. So that's Sidney Bechet, and Sidney Bechet. Not only you hear, hey, listen, I meant to say. I was attempting in the last, when we did our last jazz installment, um, Jelly Roll, to talk over the music, and my microphone just doesn't respond well, so I'm not able to kind of to talk about who's playing what when. So sorry about that, but I may gesture in sort of a corny bald white dude kind of a way. Listen, when I gesture, that's I'm trying to say that's who I'm talking about. Um, so good stuff. And I'll do my best to um, not to make too much of a fool of myself as I'm gesturing to draw your attention to particular passages. But so that's Bechet on clarinet, and you can feel him asserting himself in the improvised solo work, as well as performing the traditional role, what was the then traditional role. We're talking about early 20th century, um, the traditional role of the clarinet player, which was to kind of insinuate an improvised melody and obligato in and out of the theme, excuse me, presented by the cornet or by the trumpet, right? And that kind of hierarchy is still present, although there are a whole lot of, as we'll see later on, there are a whole lot of clarinet players and then later saxophone players that take the thematic lead, and all the instruments kind of revolve around one another. It's very exciting. It's sort of, to my mind, that's jazz at its best. Okay, so our growing history of that crucially important, uniquely American form, um, which we would have never been favored with were it not for an African American community attempting to make the instruments of the white supremacist culture that enslaved it, to make those instruments their own and to express a particular American condition. Um, very, very powerful. Okay, y'all. Well, I shall see you next time. Appreciate your going the extra mile, and hope you enjoy MLK Day.